very much. And even though I don't need an introduction, I do need to give a talk. So there it is. Oh, it's up. Okay, very cool. All right. Let's see here. Objectivism holds that the standard of all values, indeed the phenomenon from which the very act of valuing arises, is of course life, and specifically the life of human beings qua humans. But since we're each individuals, our goals, our personal goals, of course, should be our own survival, happiness, well-being, and flourishing. Objectivism, of course, also holds that the means by which we survive and flourish is our unique form of cognition, that is, reason, our rational faculty, and that we must choose to exercise it volitionally, using free will, if you will. But I argue that much more needs to be understood about human nature if we are to succeed in the enterprise that we call life. Now, some people like Nathaniel Branden, for example, has said that the whole goal of his psychology is to provide a technology so that we can get from where we are at any given time to where we want to be. And of course, he understands that you don't just sort of sit there like a computer and go, blah, 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 okay, and that's it. That we have to deal with ourselves as human beings with all sorts of attributes that we have to control, and that's what we have to do. Now, in recent years, in fact, in the past couple of decades, a number of social movements and research into evolution and psychology have converged to shed light on human nature and to offer a secular view of ethics that looks very much like it's moving in the direction of objectivist ethics. Now, we as objectivists should really be at the avant-garde of this movement. Now, what I'm going to do in the talk today is kind of three big things. First, I'm going to review just a little bit about the new secular spirit. For those of you who have heard me at some of the past summer seminars, you've heard me discuss this issue. Second, I'm going to review some of the new work in psychology, especially evolutionary psychology, and in the brain revolution. And then finally, I'm going to discuss the objectivist implications of a lot of this new work and where we can, I think, add to and in fact be the leaders in this trend. So, going first to the secular spirit. As most of you probably know, in recent decades, there's been a rise of secularism in the United States. In the past, I've quoted the Pew survey that shows that while 78% of Americans consider themselves Christian in some definition of that word, an astounding 16% consider themselves unaffiliated, atheist, agnostic, or something of that sort. And, you know, again, compared to surveys in the past, this is astounding. You might say 16% is not very big, but compared to what it used to be, like very close to zero, this is pretty remarkable. I mean, unfortunately, some of the folks who fall in that category consider themselves sort of friends of nature, so I consider that to be a form of religion, a kind of a cult, but that's a whole other topic. Further, we have seen, of course, in the past number of years, books coming out taking on religion straight on. People like Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Michael Shermer, to name the most famous of the group. But what's very interesting is that along with this new secularism, and in many cases, including some of the same people, you've seen new research and work being done in evolutionary psychology and neuroscience. In evolution, of course, Richard Dawkins not only is a famous atheist, but he's also a famous scientist who's worked in the field of evolution. You have seen a lot of new work done in brain research, the invention of the MRI. There's a functional MRI. I won't go into all the details of being able to study how the brain actually works, what's happening inside of your head when you're thinking, when you're making decisions, when you're doing certain things. There's been an incredible revolution in the last couple of decades in studying the brain. I'll mention one guy, Dr. Richard Restak, has a number of popular books out that I commend to your attention if you want a good overview of this research. And this is very interesting, but you might say, as I do, well, so what? What does it have to do with anything other than kind of some intellectual import? And what it has to do is that these studies about how the brain works, the studies in evolutionary psychology, are leading those who are involved to ask the question of how can we have a science of ethics? Can we get back to that? In the past, as you know, a lot of the people on the secular side of the equation tended to be good on objective reality, good on science, good on personal liberty, really bad on ethics. Their ethics were some form of collectivism, and therefore on politics they usually were socialists of one kind or another. But now they're actually asking the fundamental question about ethics. Can you talk about a science of ethics with all this study of the brain and evolution and so forth? So the kind of questions you might ask are, what does the research tell us about our consciousness and our moral sense? What does it say about causes of our actions and our behavior? How can the naturalist fallacy or fact-value dichotomy be dealt with? I'll come to that later. One of the problems all of these guys have is, well, this is all interesting, but we can't quite figure out how to go from the facts we've studied to statements about values. And of course, what does objectivism have to add to this discussion? Okay, now I'm going to go to the meat of this talk, and that is I'm going to talk about the particulars of psychology and the brain revolution. And let's start with some basics. Evolution, human beings evolve from lower species or different kinds of species. Evolution is a process that has honed our traits and our characteristics, including our mental capacities, towards the goal of survival. Those who had traits that differentially contributed to survival passed along their genes to us here in the room. Other species didn't quite fare so well and they're not here to give talks at conferences as we are. And some of the obvious traits are things like a sex drive for food. Presumably those who had a better sex drive passed along their genes. Those who had a drive for certain kinds of food. I like to make the example that hundreds of thousands of years ago, those who had a taste for fattening foods and sweet stuff and stuff that would give you an energy boost differentially survived to pass along their genes. Today, of course, we know that giving into those urges probably isn't the best thing if your goal is physical health. But still, the point is that a lot of these things are hardwired into us. They differ from person to person. Libidos differ, drives for food differ, and all sorts of other things differ. But the basic capacities are hardwired, and I'll talk more about that later. Now, we do share many traits with other animals, and again, a lot of this research is showing that. For example, chimps, dolphins, and even certain birds seem to have a sense of self-awareness. That is, they look in the mirror and they actually can recognize that that's me. Whereas there are other animals, I think dogs, for example, and so forth, who seem to be intelligent otherwise, but they just can't make out what the hell a mirror is. So there's a lot of things that we do share with other animals, and this should not be surprising because, after all, we evolved from animals. We are animals, right? And so it's not surprising that we share these attributes. However, what's interesting is the way evolution has resulted in kind of a new phenomenon, that is the rational human mind. I call your attention, by the way, to a book called The Prehistory of the Mind. That should be singular, of the mind, by Stephen Mitham, who kind of talks about how he looks at chimpanzees, he looks at where we came from. He uses kind of an approach from archaeology to try to trace how human cognition emerged. And again, very interesting work. Now, okay, having said that, and by the way, I will say more on determinism, because I can see all of your brains working and your cognition working, saying, well, gee, doesn't this sound very deterministic? Well, no, but I'll come to that in a little bit. Okay, we've said that evolution has hardwired us in many ways. And part of this revolution in understanding has come with Steven Pinker. During the last century, much of psychology saw the human mind as a blank slate. And not a blank slate just in terms of, there's certain kinds of knowledge that's not inborn. We have to discover it using a rational process. We all understand that kind of a blank slate. The understanding was that we were even more of a blank slate, that is, human beings were almost infinitely malleable, that environment really determines everything about us, and that that you can almost ignore biology. Interestingly enough, both Marxists and libertarians have sometimes fallen into some problems with this. Marxists most notably because they thought if we just create the right institutions, human beings will act accordingly. And now, of course, as you know, Marxists considered selfishness and looking out for self-interest to be a bad thing, so they thought, well, if we just create institutions with certain kinds of incentives, then everyone will act altruistically and, we'll have a perfect world, won't we? And of course, that didn't work out. Some libertarians tend to be a bit deterministic too. They say, well, if you just have the proper economic incentives in place, everything will be okay, kind of ignoring some more fundamental things. What has happened in the last decade or so, and one of the people who's really popularized it is Steven Pinker in his book, The Blank Slate, is that there's been a rediscovery of human nature, a rediscovery of the importance of biology. Pinker, by the way, his first book that became very popular was called How the Mind Works, where he talked about the mind as kind of modular, not just in the sense of physical, but it's an integrated whole, but it works in a certain kind of way. And his more recent book, The Blank Slate, really takes on the notion that we're infinitely malleable and says, no, we're not infinitely malleable. So that's Pinker. Now, let's take this line of thought a little bit further. Not only do physical capacities evolve and have been hardwired into us, there's a new strain of thought and research that says moral capacities also were things that evolved and are hardwired into us. It's a little bit more controversial. A lot of the material I'm taking is from Robert Wright's book, The Moral Animal, Why We Are the Way We Are, The New Science of Evolutionary Psychology. There's been a lot of other work done in this area. I call your attention to his book as a nice summary. But what people like Wright say is this, that we have to understand that human biology matters. In the past, there's been a reluctance to say that because this insight has been abused, and especially by racists. Nazis, for example, said, yes, human biology matters, and blacks are different from whites, and Jews are different from everyone else, and da-da-da-da-da. And he came up with this whole way of thinking, or misthinking, I would say, in the 1930s that really stressed differences between human beings as groups. And most of that turned out to be, by the way, really bad science, to say nothing about being really bad ethically. And so a lot of the people who are doing this research are very cognizant of that, but they're saying, be that as it may, what they're discovering is that what cultural anthropologists have seen for some time, that there seems to be cross-culturally lots of things that unite people. We all have certain kinds of family relations. Peer groups are important for people everywhere, whether you're in an advanced industrial society or you're in the rainforest of Brazil. Things like friendships, gossip, social status, all of these kind of things not only are things that are observed now by anthropologists, but they're observed, so to speak, from the inside by people doing brain research and evolutionary psychologists who are looking at somehow these attributes. For example, the capacity and the desire to be accepted by peer groups. Those things have come out of evolution and in some ways are hardwired in us as well. Now, Wright describes it this way. He calls these attributes, by the way, these include things, for example, like a capacity for guilt. Think about, you might have had a human species in the past that somehow didn't have a capacity for guilt, that when they did something that was wrong, they just went, oh, okay. But we seem to have this, everyone, laid down in the hardwiring of our system, a capacity to feel guilt. You know, sometimes it's undeserved guilt, sometimes it's deserved guilt, but things like that, a sense of justice, and this is very controversial. These evolutionary biologists say that a sense of justice is something that somehow is biological based and not just culturally and ideologically based. And what these guys do is they emphasize the cross-cultural nature of this. Wright, getting back to my point here, says that in a sense these are the knobs of human nature. We're all have this kind of wiring, but he calls them knobs rather than wiring because he says they're adjustable. First of all, you're going to find that you have different capacities or different attributes in different people. Some people are going to sort of have a tendency to be very self-assured. Others are going to be very sort of a thirst for approval. And he suggests that that's biological. And by the way, there's other research done by various biologists that kind of points in that direction. But what Wright says is that these things are adjustable. They're adjustable by the environment and they're adjustable by us as individuals. So, you know, I might think I have a tendency for something and I kind of try to compensate for it. I had a bunch of long quotes here, but I'm going to pass those up. I'm going to kind of move along a little faster here. So, but what's one of the things that's very interesting about Wright's work and some of the others, they emphasize the unity of their discoveries, the cross-cultural nature of their discoveries. But one of the things you find is that their discoveries point to a very individualist understanding of human beings. And actually, maybe I will quote here. There's a kind of human nature whose very function is to generate differences among people as they grow. Wright talks about how there's so many different ways that we're influenced by environment, by our own ideas and so forth, that we have these capacities, but you know, just like there are billions of people, we're all very individualistic. Very interesting implications of this research. And I'll show you where that's going in a few minutes. I'm going to move over this part kind of quickly just because one of the you can also look at a human social and moral sense, and there's a lot of work that's been done about that. A guy named Jonathan Haidt, and I'll hold up his book, The Happiness Hypothesis here, argues that we have certain kind of social sense that again is ingrained in us, and he even goes further and talks about how reason is often subservient to a social sense, to a certain what's the word I'm using here? Emotion, certain kinds of emotions that we have a tendency towards. He describes reason as almost like steering an elephant. You can't stop the elephant from moving. You're on top of this thing that's our human nature, and you can't make it do whatever you want, but you can kind of steer it, and he has a whole theory about that. So I'm sort of giving you a little bit of a review of the literature here. I'm going to move on faster, skip a couple of these because I want to get to some very interesting research here. One of the more interesting bits of research has been done about whether we have an innate moral sense. Now that's getting pretty controversial. You know, we can go from an innate sense for food and sex, okay, that's cool. Maybe we have an innate sort of social sense. Yeah, okay, you might buy that. Now we're getting into some controversial areas. A number of people have done research to try to show that we have an innate moral sense, that the capacities for, you know, what we would call moral action, moral thought, are ingrained. And the book I recommend there, if you're interested, is Moral Minds, The Nature of Right and Wrong by Mark Hauser. And how... Mark, oh, sorry. Yeah, I got this typo in the thing there. Mark Hauser, it should be. I would change it on here, but then I'd have to take the slide out. That's Hauser, Hauser. That's the book's right here. And he looks, among other things, there was a question a philosopher, Philip of Foot, raised. This was many decades ago, and a number of people have tried to actually test the implications of this. And what I'm going to do is just go ahead and give you the test, so to speak. They set up a number of scenarios. Okay, this is the crude graphics here. Okay, I want to give you a scenario and see how you all react. Again, there's no right or wrong answer to this. Okay, you are standing beside the train track here, okay? And you see there's a trolley that's barreling down the track, and you kind of see that the conductor has, flopped over. He's on the floor. It's obviously this thing is out of control. Not going to be able to stop. You see down the track there are 5 people. It's a big embankment there, so there's no way they're going to be able to get out of the way of the train. Okay? You see that there's a side track here. There's one guy standing on the side track, and you're standing there. If you pull the switch, the train's going to go off onto the side track. It'll hit this guy, but it will spare the other guys. Okay, what do you do? Real quick, the train's barreling. How many of you guys pull the switch? Quick. Very interesting. How many of you guys don't pull the switch? Okay, that's interesting. We got almost an equal distribution in this room. And there are a lot of people who didn't do anything. You froze. Okay, the 5 guys are dead. Okay? Seriously, now the 5 people are dead. Okay. When this test, when surveys are done about this, the vast majority of people say they would pull the switch. And this is not surprising. It's a matter of, look, 5 people are going to be dead or 1 person's going to be dead, and they pull the switch. And the vast majority of people, and by the way, some of this has been tested cross-culturally. Most of it, of course, started by testing it with, college undergraduates. Would you take the survey? And not only in the United States, but in other countries. And then they started to do the testing in Eastern cultures, because maybe Indians think differently than Americans and French people and all. And then they've actually tried to expand it to other places, like, okay, instead of a trolley, imagine a herd of elephants is coming down, so for people who don't know what trolleys are, okay? What's interesting is cross-culturally, you get a very strong opinion that you pull the switch. Okay, and the notion is that maybe there's an innate moral sense. But then they take it even further. Okay, scenario number 2. You're standing on a bridge overlooking the track, okay, watching the sunset. You're there with a big fat guy, okay? Nothing against fat people, but I'm just saying. Okay, you're standing there. Same scenario. The train is coming barreling down the track, okay? And there's no switch. The 5 people are there. They're going to be killed. Okay, the only way to stop it is to push the fat guy off the bridge, and he's going to land on the track, and he'll stop the train. How many of you guys push the fat guy? Hands, please. No one. Okay, maybe Bill over there, but okay. Troublemaker. Anyway, but the point is that, again, cross-culturally, virtually nobody would push the fat guy off the track. But isn't it the same thing? You save 5 lives, you sacrifice 1? Huh, interesting. Okay, another scenario. Okay, you got the track here, and this time, if you pull the switch, same thing, train barreling down the track, you pull the switch, the train will be gone onto a siding where the fat guy is standing on the track, and it's going to stop the train. Okay, and the thing comes back onto the track there. But the point is, if you pull the switch, the train goes off, it hits the fat guy, stops, and you save the other 5 people. Okay, how many people pull the switch in that case? We do have a couple. Okay, interestingly enough, most people say no. Well, wait a minute. Let me finish that. This is the whole interesting thing about this set of tests and now let me go to the next scenario. Most people on this one say no. The next one is, there's a same scenario, the fat guy is standing on the track, but there's a big rock, and the big rock is going to stop the train. Whether there's a fat guy there or not, or a thin guy or any guy, there's a big rock sitting there, and the big rock's going to stop the train, okay? How many people pull the switch now? Okay, we've got more people pulling the switch with the rock there. Okay, now the explanation, and again, this is people trying to figure out, well, why do people react like this? Is there an innate moral sense? One of the issues that seems to come up here is to explain these differences is that people are uncomfortable using other people instrumentally. In other words, in the first scenario, let me go back here. In the first scenario, it's just incidental that this guy happens to unfortunately be on the track. You don't mean to kill him. He's not instrumental to what you're doing. What you're doing is you're diverting the train so you will save the 5 people. And it just happens as unfortunately this guy's standing there, okay? That's too bad. Whereas in this case, the bridge case, the guy, it's actually killing another person that's instrumental in saving these lives. And there's something very uncomfortable about that for many people. Again, in this case, you have the same sort of thing. Now, this case, by the way, you get more people who pull the switch here because you don't have to physically push him, but he's still instrumental. So there's still a reluctance to pull the switch in scenario number 3. Scenario number 4, then again, it really is the rock that's stopping it, and the guy just, even whether he's fat or thin, he just kind of is there. So he's not instrumental. The notion that somehow the Kantian notion in morality that you should only treat people as ends and never as means, what these guys are suggesting is that might be biologically based. By the way, I'm not saying that necessarily it is or not, but I'm saying that there's very interesting research being done, and they're trying to do it cross-culturally, so it's not just, you know, what do a bunch of American enculturated college students think. By the way, I'll give you a 5th one. Some people, and then when you ask people, why do you do that? Why do you make these decisions? Well, they don't quite know how to explain it. Some people say, well, you save 5, you kill 1. Psst, simple math, isn't it? No, because here's the 5th scenario. Okay, hospital emergency room, okay? 5 ambulances come in. They got 5 people. 1 person needs a heart. 2 people need kidneys. 1 person needs a lung, and 1 person needs something else, okay? There's no time to do the search. You don't have months. You literally, these people are going to die within, like, you know, a few minutes, okay? There's a healthy guy sitting in the waiting room, right? Healthy heart, 2 healthy kidneys. If we just grab this guy out of the waiting room, we can harvest those organs and we can save 5 people, but we kill 1. How many people do that? Nobody. We actually got unanimity in this room. Nobody does that. And in these surveys, virtually nobody does this, would do that, okay? What this is getting at is that perhaps there's a biological basis for our moral capacities that go beyond just, you know, sort of the things that we've talked about earlier. And again, I'm reserving judgment here, but I'm saying something very interesting is going on with the way our minds work. And again, it's not because people in the different countries seem to have all studied philosophy and read the same philosophers and so forth. In most cases, these are people who haven't read philosophy. You say maybe they got it from the culture. Well, that's possible, but in Eastern countries as well as Western countries and even in third world countries, the reactions seem to follow the same patterns. And by the way, they say the differentiating for sex and race and so forth also finds the same sort of results generally, okay? Very, very interesting. And again, the idea is that maybe evolution had something to do with laying down these patterns. So let me move on to the next one. I'm going to move along a little faster because I want to get to the sort of my conclusions and get some Q&A. There's even been work done, and actually the previous book that I held up, Jonathan Haidt also talks about this, but the most famous work has been done by Antonio Damasio, and his book, Descartes' Error. And he's very critical, of course, of the Cartesian notion of human consciousness, that there's kind of a little homunculus in our brain, and that what's happening is, you know, kind of, it's almost like the world is a movie being shown on our brain, in our brain, and there's a little homunculus guy looking at it and saying, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. And he makes this dichotomy between the soul, which is this little thing there or whatever, and then there's the body, and this is the Cartesian dichotomy. Damasio, of course, rejects this, and he suggests a much more integrated understanding of how emotions work with and influence thinking. how emotions work with and influence thinking. And again, I could do a whole lecture, maybe I will at a future event, on this, because it really does involve our view of ethics and how it works. After all, we as objectivists say, well, you make decisions based on reason. Now, by the way, Ayn Rand, interestingly enough, of course, understood that emotions are very important, that they're kind of an instantaneous summary of the values that you have. What Damasio might say, and some of these evolutionary biologists might say, that's true, and some of those views come from your philosophy and your ideology, but a lot of them also come from your biology. So anyway, I just wanted to get that in there. I'm going to move on now to the sort of conclusions, which is a long section. What are the objectivist implications, and what about this with this research? Well, I want to start going back to Wright, but he's not the only one. A lot of these guys who are doing this evolutionary biology warn us against the naturalistic fallacy, what they call that, the is-alt dichotomy. They say, okay, the fact that, for example, all human beings seem to have a tribal aspect to us, where there's something that was laid down hundreds of thousands of years ago, that there's an innate suspicion of people who don't quite look like us, right? And maybe that's because hundreds of thousands of years ago, if someone didn't look like you, they were from a different tribe, and they were going to beat you on the head, and so probably it was a good idea to avoid them. Of course, today, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If your goal is prosperity, the fact that someone looks different, they're black or they're Asian or they're white, if you happen to be an Asian, white people look different, don't we? Let's take it from their perspective. Of course, we know that that doesn't make sense. So they're saying that the fact that we might have these kind of urges or these kind of hard wiring doesn't necessarily mean that we should be doing something about it and giving into it, any more than the fact that we have libidos means that every time you see someone who you sort of find sexy, you go for it, because not only are you going to probably get arrested and slapped, but there are reasons why it's not a good idea. If you want to have a long-term enduring relationship with others, it's probably not a good idea that every time you get horny and you just grab whoever's around, right? Okay, so the naturalist fallacy, the naturalist thing would be to say, well, hey, I'm horny, evolution gave me a libido, and damn it, I'm going to go with it, okay? And these guys say, no, that's not right. And they're correct as far as they go, but they go too far. That's correct, and what I'm going to do now is, this is very, very interesting. I mentioned earlier Sam Harris, who wrote the book, The End of Faith, Letter to a Christian Nation. He's kind of considered one of the four horsemen of the new atheist movement. Harris, in the last year or so, has come to said some very interesting things from our perspective. Sam Harris has come right out and said this whole idea of an is-alt dichotomy is bunk. And I'll give you just a few quotes from Sam Harris, and this is from a recent talk he gave, and he's supposed to be coming out with a book any time, and I haven't seen the book yet, but hope to. He asserts that science can, in principle, help us understand what we should do and should want, and perforce what other people should do and want in order to live the best lives possible. He says there is a right and wrong answer. That's a typo there. There's a right and wrong answer to moral questions, just as there are right and wrong answers to questions of physics. He is very clear in saying that saying this. Some people say that, well, science can tell us what the means are to get to where we want to go, but where we want to go is something that there can't be a science of. Harris is rejecting that. He's saying very strongly, no, science can tell you something about the ends and the goals and what you ought or should do. This is pretty damn radical coming from this camp. I'll give you another couple here, quotes from Sam Harris. My further claim is that well-being is what we can intelligibly value. In morality, whatever people's associations with this term happen to be, really relates to the intentions and behaviors that affect the well-being of conscious creatures. And again, very, very interesting quotes. By the way, here's one. I don't think I put this in my quote list. He says, I believe that we can know through reason alone that consciousness is the only intelligible domain of value. What's the alternative? And then he goes on to say, so what about people who think that morality has nothing to do with anyone's well-being? I'm saying that we need not worry about them, just as we don't worry about the people who think that their physics is synonymous with astrology or sympathetic magic or Ventana, unquote. This is pretty remarkable coming from someone with his background. And by the way, I think politically he still is on the liberal left. I don't know. I'll email him and ask him. I've had some correspondence with him. Yeah. Okay. This is not from a book. This is from a speech actually it is from something that he wrote after he gave a famous TED speech, which you can Google and find. And I can give you the citation. I know it's been posted on a number of places. There's a Project Reason website, and Sam Harris has this new thing called Project Reason. One of our trustees, Cliff Asness, has been associated with that organization. And you look at the list of the people on their advisory board, and it's people like Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and a lot of the usual suspects. But this is from something that he's written, and I assume that this basically is what we're going to be seeing in his book. Very, very interesting that we now have this convergence of people who've been the new atheists, the people in evolutionary psychology, the people in brain research, are all kind of converging on this notion that, hey, there might be an objective ethics. Now, what I at Hudgins would say is that, yes, there is a unique source of human action. Biology and evolution is important, and it's good that we're rediscovering that human beings have a nature. You read the John Galt speech, and that's what it's all about. Man has a certain nature. We're not just, blanks, okay? Even though Rand uses the word blank slate in an epistemological sense, when you're talking about cognitive knowledge, that's a correct use of that term. But in other ways, it isn't. Our environment, our family, peer groups, educational institutions also determine a lot. We have the basic biology, but it's really our experiences. But this is the key thing. Our ideas and our free will ultimately can trump these other things. We can understand our nature, we can understand our proclivities as individuals and as a species, and we can do something about it. And what's interesting is that, again, this new group of atheists and evolutionary biologists or psychologists all tend to say that, yes, human beings, whether it's Dennett or Michael Shermer, who I'll come to in a minute, they all acknowledge that somehow self-consciousness is tied to the notion that we have personal responsibility for our actions at some level, whether you want to call it free will or not. Dennett has a whole book where he discusses it called Freedom Evolves. I have some issues with it, but all of them now, or pretty much most of the major ones, say, yes, we have some form of free will. We're not simply tools of the environment or whatever. Again, very, very interesting that we've gotten to this point. One of the other things, and again, I could do a whole lecture on this, there is a whole new series, a whole new area of study called happiness studies. Can you imagine? Happiness studies. And I put in here, this is a quote from Ayn Rand in 1960. Rand said, in psychology, we are told that man is a helpless automaton determined by forces beyond his control, motivated by inane depravity, unquote. How times have changed, and for the better. We now have a whole series of studies called happiness studies. Now, by the way, I will now jump in and say that there are problems with these happiness studies. There's a thing called the Easterling paradox, and this guy basically argues that there's a paradox because in advanced countries with lots of material stuff like us, happiness isn't going up, it's kind of flatlining. Now, by the way, I call your attention also to a good piece that Will Wilkinson did for the Cato Institute, where he reviewed all of these studies. What is the piece called? It's called In Pursuit of Happiness Research. Is it reliable? What does it imply for policy? Because a lot of these people, unfortunately, have taken happiness studies, and there are a lot of measurement problems with it and so forth. But I'm just calling your attention to the fact that there is this thing called happiness studies, and there's very interesting stuff going on with that. Final thing I'll talk about a little bit is Michael Shermer, and then I'll conclude. Shermer is the one who's kind of come closest, I think, to the truth about this. I'm going to skip his, because we're running out of time here, I'm going to go ahead and skip his happiness principle. He has this principle that says it's a higher moral principle that to always seek happiness with someone else's happiness in mind and never seek happiness when it leads to someone else's unhappiness. By the way, he believes in following your self-interest, okay? But he's trying to come up with a way to sort of how individuals integrate with society. And I've talked to him about this, and there's an article in my book on secularism and objectivism about this, where I pointed out that how can you have someone else's happiness in mind if they're irrational? If, for example, if your mother, who you love dearly, would be crying if you became a lawyer, but you really want to become a lawyer and not a mathematician. Well, the problem is your mother's irrational, and so being concerned about her happiness, you should be concerned about her happiness, but she's the one who's irrational. So there's some problems with that thing. But what I wanted to get to is Shermer hold up another book for you, The Science of Good and Evil. In this book, Shermer outlines his idea of values. He also rejects subjectivism, okay, as we do. He also rejects what he calls absolute values or absolutist values. This is his critique, by the way, of objectivism, and I think he's incorrect on this. And he's talking about sort of religious values. If you just say it's just out of all context, don't ever, have sex with somebody who is a different or not of a different gender or whatever it is. He says absolutist morality is kind of almost like religious, and this is just it. Out of all context is wrong. And I agree with him on that, okay? What he does, and he mistakes objectivist values for these absolutist values. He says that the right thing is what he calls provisional values. And he tends to think about it statistically. Well, you might not know completely whether this is a good idea or a bad idea, but you kind of have a 90% chance this is probably a good idea and 10% that it might be a bad idea. So he says you can kind of do that. I think that he hasn't gotten quite to the root yet of values, and what I've argued with him is that no, objectivists really can answer your dilemma, so to speak, and that is that an objectivist understands that yes, human beings are the valuing critters, okay? Our ability to value comes from our nature as rational human beings, and this is kind of my conclusion, rational individualism, that we are all individuals. The creature that is self-conscious, and this is the thing these guys are all fascinated about, is the fact that we're self-conscious. The self-conscious creature is the individual. It's not the race. Therefore, whenever you talk about what is good, it has to be the good of the individual, and it's always going to be contextual. Yes, there's a human nature and there's an objective reality, but what's going to be proper for you at any given time is going to be very specific for you, the individuals, and there's a whole discovery process of how you get to that point. In other words, objectivism can integrate these insights from evolutionary psychology, these insights of the new brain science, and of the new thinking about our ethical nature. Again, even if a lot of these people are wrong, and there's still questions about their findings, I think that objectivism can pull it all together and integrate it and offer something that really moves us along and hopefully adds to the debate and basically takes a whole realm of research and says it points to what Ayn Rand understood decades ago. I thank you for your attention, and if we have time for a question or two, I would appreciate it.
Ready for the mic. Time for 3 or 4, depending on the length.
Okay, time for a couple of... Yeah, why don't we start with my colleague Will Thomas. Will?
Ed, I believe in discussing Hauser's book, The Moral Sense. That's Hauser, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He went through a list of these trolley experiments.
Yep.
These are all ethics of emergency examples.
That's right.
They consider a conflict of interest where people's survivals are directly in conflict, and considers a choice about killing some people versus killing others as a quintessentially moral issue. I want to ask you how a problem that no one has experienced and that is of a kind disconnected from real moral problems of living and achieving happiness can tell us something really valid about people's real moral traits.
By the way, I agree with you that that's the nature of the experiment. It's what Ayn Rand called actually a lifeboat situation. Okay, I brought this up because what Hauser's trying to do, I think, is something valid to, and I think even more so people like, again, even though I'm not in complete agreement with him either, Jonathan Haidt and some of these others are kind of looking at a lot more subtle aspects of whether we have a moral sense, and to what extent is reason and emotions tied together, and to what extent can you kind of transcend these things. I used that example because yes, they are lifeboat situations, but I agree with you that I think what this points to is to say, okay, can we talk about rules for example, happiness and so forth? And I think we can, and I think it does point to something where you get away from the lifeboat situation. In one sense, it's like maybe the sex example I gave, okay? You have a libido, you kind of see someone walking down the street, hey, they're pretty good looking, maybe, I'll grab them. And then there's, you can ask questions about whether it's right or wrong and so forth. But ultimately, if you want to talk about how to run your life, you're going to have to come out with a theory of what is the role of sex, for example, in human life, right? Where does it fit into personal relations? All of these kind of things. So yes, the basics might be laid down and hardwired, but what I'm arguing is that we have to step back and do exactly what you're suggesting. By the way, there are interesting things that some of these other guys do. And again, you might say these are emergency situations, but they'll ask, for example, okay, there's a brother and a sister, and they're in some place where they've been left for the weekend. They're like both 16 years old, and they've been left for the weekend, and they say, maybe we should have sex together, and you have condoms, and there's no chance we're going to get pregnant. We just want to do it one time. Would it be okay? And this is to test the incest. Is whether we have an incest bias, and there are lots of. By the way, that's interesting because I always say that the Egyptians seem to disprove that particular one. But there's a lot of this experimenting and research going on to say what has been laid down, and it's useful to know this. It's useful to know that maybe we do have a bias towards what Kant would say a rejection of using people as instruments. That's nice to know, right? Now, what we do with it, that's where you have to turn to philosophy, I think. Don.
I'm not an expert in this field, but I've noticed a phenomenon which no one else ever seems to comment on, and that is that sociobiology has become, at least for some people, a new kind of instinct theory or witchcraft, where everything and anything is attributed to innate evolutionary drives.
Right.
One example, which you touched on humorously, is really not very funny. Some years ago, a couple of guys published a book claiming that rape is an innate evolutionary drive because, after all, it does help the species survive. And there was such an outcry from feminists and others that these two authors were driven out of town on a rail and largely forgotten. I noticed that it might have provided a very nice excuse for the rapist. It's not my fault. It's all evolutionary. Now, even to this day, I possibly read and hear that this human behavior and that human behavior is somehow evolutionary. And my question is, where in this picture do we have responsibility, free will, voluntary activities? And I'd like your comment on that.
Yeah. By the way, I'm in agreement with you. And the best people in the field, by the way, understand that. And they realize that there's kind of a cop-out where every kind of behavior you say, well, of course, it's evolutionary, right? Well, no, not exactly. First of all, the human psyche is very complex. It's an emergent phenomenon, you might say, that has its own rules. So, the example you gave that, by the way, there would be an example where the naturalist fallacy it comes into effect. Okay, well, I have a libido, and it's good for biology that I spread my seed because that's what evolution wants, right? That's what biology wants, and therefore I should go rape anyone I want. Well, No, that is incorrect. Why is it incorrect? Well, we can step back and again say that a fact doesn't necessarily imply a value in this way. You have to have a grander theory and understanding in order to make that case. And as I say, there have been Shermer, even Dennett, and a number of these people do now talk and do this work on where is personal responsibility and free will. I could do a whole class on that. Maybe next time I'll just do free will in the new biology or something. But your points are very, very well taken. Yeah, David.
Yeah, Ed, I have a historian's question. Your discussion of some of these studies on the human social sense, and particularly the moral sense, reminded me so much of 18th century Scottish Enlightenment writers, Smith, Ferguson, Hutchison, and so on. Are any of these modern writers aware of that very close parallel between what they're saying now and what people were saying in the 18th century?
I haven't seen a lot of this, by the way. That's what's fascinating, is that a lot of these guys seem to be groping towards something that, you know, kind of looks like insights that the Enlightenment thinkers had, certainly insights that objectivist thinkers have had, but except for Shermer, I don't think any of them are coming from that perspective. I don't know. You might know back there know Dennett better than I do. I don't know if Dennett has ever read Ayn Rand or knows anything about Ayn Rand. If I had to bet, I bet that he probably thinks Ayn Rand is this radical right-wing nut. But I don't know. But no, I don't know that they're familiar with this thing, and that's why this is fascinating. They're coming from a completely different direction than we are, but they're kind of groping towards something where they can basically say human beings are responsible, and as I did the quotes from Harris, the realm of values and ethics is human consciousness, human well-being, and then suddenly you get into a whole different discussion, the discussion that Will Thomas just suggested, that rather than just discussing trolleys and elephants going towards 5 people to kill them, we talk about how you should run your life. And of course, that's exactly the debate and the discussion I want to have. And we got one more real quick. Yeah.
How do these scientists who are supposedly studying happiness define happiness?
That is a whole big question. In fact, it's one of my things I had in, I think, one of my little slides here. Where is it? Right at the bottom. Definition, measurement problems. How do you define happiness? One of the problems they have is that most of them start with survey data. So they say, you know, how do you feel at any given time? And then there's a whole series of objections you can say that, well, you know, there's a thing where, for example, let's say you're in a pretty crappy situation. Your life is just kind of generally crappy, but you know, you're making the best of it, and you know, you're kind of keep a positive attitude. So if any given time someone comes up to you and says, "So how do you feel?" You say, "Oh, you know, not too bad." And then there are people who are really doing well, but well, their career's not going as well as they might, and so forth. And you know, so if you ask them how things going now, well, not very well. Would you rather exchange your situation for the guy over here who's living in a slum? And they'll say, no way. So there's a whole series of problems. And again, I call your attention to Will Wilkinson's paper for Cato that really does a good job of taking these things apart. But again, the fact that we're having this discussion now, instead of discussing human depravity and so forth, we're discussing well-being, what's best for our consciousness, these kinds of things. This is an incredible development as far as I'm concerned, and it's something objectivists should really be jumping into, contributing to. Okay, is that it? Okay, thanks a lot, folks.